Commander Lyria had seen many things in her 300 years of life, but nothing had ever looked quite as pathetic as the human ship floating before her fleet. She stood tall on the bridge of her flagship with her silver hair falling past her shoulders and her pointed ears twitching with barely controlled irritation. Behind her, the twin dragons Ember and Frost lay coiled around the massive command pillars that rose from the floor to the ceiling. Ember was red as fresh blood with scales that glowed like hot metal, and smoke drifted lazily from her nostrils. Frost was pale blue with scales like ice crystals, and cold mist pooled around her massive claws. Both dragons watched the viewing screen with ancient eyes that had witnessed centuries of battles and victories. The human vessel was small and ugly, with none of the flowing lines that made elven ships beautiful. It looked like someone had welded together a collection of metal boxes and called it a spacecraft. Lyria could not understand how such a thing even managed to fly, let alone cross the vast distances between stars. Her tactical officer stood at his station to her left and reported that the human ship had entered their protected space without permission. This area of space belonged to the elven people by ancient treaty, and any vessel that entered without authorization was subject to immediate expulsion. Or worse. Lyria felt her jaw tighten with anger. Humans were a young species barely 50 years into space travel, and already they thought they could ignore the rules that governed civilized societies. She had dealt with their kind before, and found them arrogant despite their primitive technology. They built crude ships and talked about peace while their governments squabbled over resources like children fighting over toys. She tapped the communication crystal embedded in her command chair and felt the familiar tingle of magic as it connected to the human vessel. A moment later, a face appeared on the main viewing screen. The human captain was young, probably no more than 30 standard years, with messy brown hair that stuck up in several directions. He wore a simple gray uniform that looked worn and faded, and his eyes had the tired look of someone who had been working too many hours without rest. His name tag identified him as Captain Jake Murphy. He smiled at her with an expression that seemed almost friendly, and Lyria felt her anger spike higher. This human did not seem to understand the danger he was in. She leaned forward in her chair and spoke with ice in her voice. She told him that he had violated sacred elven territory, and that his presence here was an insult to her people. She informed him that 20 warships surrounded his pathetic vessel, and that her dragons could reduce it to molten slag with a single breath. She demanded that he turn his ship around immediately and leave elven space before she decided to make an example of him. Captain Murphy listened to her entire speech without interrupting. When she finished, he scratched his chin thoughtfully and glanced at something off-screen before looking back at her. He spoke in a calm voice and told her that he understood her concern, but he was on an urgent supply run to a human colony on Kepler 7. He explained that this route through elven space would save him 3 full days of travel time, and that the colonists were depending on the medical supplies and food he carried. He asked politely if she might consider allowing him to pass just this once. Lyria could not believe what she was hearing. This human was asking her for permission after he had already broken their laws. She stood up from her chair and took several steps toward the viewing screen. Her voice rose with each word as she told him that she did not care about his schedule or his colonists. She informed him that his ridiculous ship looked like it had been assembled from spare parts, and that it could never hope to outrun her fleet, even if she gave him a generous head start. Behind her, Ember raised her massive head and released a stream of flame that lit up the bridge. The dragon's roar echoed through the chamber, and Lyria saw several of her crew members step back. Nervously, Frost remained still, but her eyes glowed with cold light, and the temperature on the bridge dropped several degrees. Captain Murphy watched the display of power without flinching. Instead, his smile grew wider, and he asked her a simple question. He wanted to know if she was absolutely certain that his ship could not outrun hers. Lyria felt something surge through her chest pride. It burned hotter than dragon fire and sharper than any blade. She had trained for 200 years in the art of tactical command. She had led fleets into battle against pirates and rival houses. She had never lost a race, and she had never backed down from a challenge. She told the human captain that she was not just certain, but that she would stake her honor on it. The Elven Interceptors. In her fleet were the fastest ships in 12 star systems. They could reach point 0.8 light speed in under 4 seconds, and their engines had been refined over thousands of years of engineering. Nothing in known space could match them. Captain Murphy nodded slowly and made a suggestion. He proposed a wager. If his ship could reach the jump point at the edge of the system before her interceptors caught him, she would allow all human vessels to use this route freely in the future. But if he lost, he would never come this way again, and he would personally deliver an apology to the Elven Council. Lyria felt laughter bubble up from deep in her chest. It was a beautiful sound, like silver bells ringing, but there was no kindness in it. She agreed immediately to his terms. The idea that this ugly little human ship could outrun her finest vessels was so ridiculous that she almost felt bad for taking advantage of him. Almost, but not quite. She turned to her tactical officer and ordered him to prepare the fastest interceptor squadron for immediate launch. 5 ships detached from the main fleet and took up positions behind the human vessel. Each interceptor was sleek and deadly, with engines that hummed with barely contained power. Their pilots were the best in the fleet, with reflexes enhanced by decades of training and neural implants that connected them directly to their ships. Lyria returned to her command chair and announced that she would give the human exactly 10 seconds to begin running, would count down personally, and when she reached 0, the race would begin. Captain Murphy gave her a small salute that seemed almost mocking and told her he was ready whenever she was. Lyria began to count. Her voice rang out clear and strong through the communication channel 1098. She watched the human ship on her screen and saw its engines begin to glow with a soft blue light. 765. The interceptors behind Murphy's vessel shifted into attack formation with their weapon systems powered down but their engines at full readiness. 432 Ember and Frost both raised their heads and fixed their ancient eyes on the viewing screen. 10 Lyria expected to see the human ship accelerate away from her fleet with its primitive engines straining against the laws of physics. Instead, something impossible happened. The ugly little vessel simply vanished. One moment, it was floating in space directly in front of her interceptors, and the next moment, it was gone as if someone had reached down and plucked it from existence. Lyria's breath caught in her throat. Her hands gripped the arms of her command chair so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Around her, the bridge crew erupted in confused shouts, and her sensor officer frantically checked her instruments. Even Ember and Frost seemed stunned. The 2 dragons uncurled from their pillars and moved closer to the viewing screen, with their massive heads tilting from side to side. Lyria found her voice and demanded a status report. The sensor officer was a young elf named Kira, who had served on the flagship for only 20 years. Her hands shook as she worked the controls of her station, and her voice cracked when she tried to speak. She cleared her throat and tried again, reported that the human ship had reached the jump point at the edge of the system. Lyria stared at her in disbelief. She demanded to know how long it had taken from the moment she said 0 until the ship arrived at its destination. Kira checked her instruments once and then checked them again. She looked up at Lyria with wide eyes and said that according to every sensor on the ship, the journey had taken exactly 0.8 seconds. The bridge fell completely silent. Even the usual hum of the engine seemed to fade away as every crew member processed what they had just heard. Ember released a low rumble that sounded almost like confusion, and Frost's tail lashed back and forth, sending waves of cold air across the deck. Lyria felt her world tilt sideways. 0.8 seconds. Her interceptors had barely begun to accelerate. Their engines had just started to push them forward when the human ship vanished. At their maximum speed, it would have taken her fastest vessels nearly 30 seconds to cover that distance. This human had done it in less than 1. She stood up from her chair and took 3 steps toward the viewing screen before her legs suddenly felt weak. She caught herself on the edge of the tactical station, and her tactical officer reached out to steady her. She waved him away and forced herself to stand straight. 300 years of training and discipline helped her regain control of her emotions. She turned to face her crew and saw confusion and fear on many of their faces. Some of them looked angry as if the human had cheated somehow. Others looked excited as if they had just witnessed something incredible. Lyria understood both reactions because she felt them herself. Her communication crystal chimed softly, and she knew without looking that it was the human captain. She walked back to her chair and sat down slowly before accepting the connection. Captain Murphy's face appeared on the screen again, but this time he was not smiling. His expression was serious and professional, and his tired eyes seemed to look right through her. He spoke first and told her that he hoped she understood now why human ships needed to use this route. He explained that his people did not ask for permission lightly, but that their needs were genuine and urgent. Lyria found her voice, though it sounded strange to her own ears. She asked him the only question that mattered, how Murphy seemed to consider his answer carefully before responding. He told her that human engines worked on completely different principles than most other species in the galaxy. He said that while elven ships and most other vessels pushed themselves through space by generating thrust, human ships had learned to fold space itself. He explained that his ship did not actually travel the distance between 2 points. Instead, it brought those 2 points together and stepped across. Lyria felt her mind struggling to grasp the concept. The elven people had explored space for thousands of years. They had encountered dozens of intelligent species and studied hundreds of different propulsion systems. She had never heard of anything like what the human was describing. She asked him how his people had developed such technology when they had only achieved faster than light travel 50 years ago. Murphy's expression softened slightly. He told her that humans had a saying that went back thousands of years to before they even left their homeworld. Necessity is the mother of invention. He explained that Earth had been dying when humans first developed space travel. Their sun was aging and their planet was becoming increasingly hostile to life. Resources were scarce and conflicts over what remained had nearly destroyed their civilization. They had colonies on nearby planets but no way to reach them quickly. Supply ships took months to make journeys that needed to happen in days. People died waiting for medicine and food. Entire colonies were lost because help could not arrive in time. So human scientists and engineers worked day and night to find a solution. They studied physics in ways no one had thought to study it before. They asked questions that seemed impossible and looked for answers in places others had ignored, and eventually, after decades of failure and loss, they succeeded. Murphy paused and looked directly at Lyria. He told her that when your species faces extinction, you learn to do things others say cannot be done. You find ways to survive because the alternative is unacceptable. Lyria felt something shift inside her chest. She had heard that tone before in the voices of other elven commanders who had survived impossible battles. It was the sound of someone who had looked death in the face and refused to blink. She understood it because the elven people had their own history of near extinction. Long ago, before they had learned to bond with dragons, her ancestors had been hunted by other species who saw them as weak. They had been pushed to the edge of annihilation before they discovered the ancient magic that allowed them to communicate with and ride the great dragons. Those bonds had saved the elven civilization and made them strong enough to claim their place among the stars. Looking at this human captain, Lyria realized that his people had found their own way to survive. They had used science instead of magic, but the result was the same. They had refused to die quietly, glanced back at Ember and Frost. The two dragons had moved closer to the viewing screen and were watching Murphy with what looked like interest. Dragons were ancient creatures with wisdom that went beyond what most beings could understand. They could sense things about people that others missed. The fact that both dragons seemed curious rather than hostile told Lyria something important. This human was worth listening to. She turned back to the screen and told Murphy that she would honor their agreement. Human ships could use this route freely from now on. She expected him to look smug or satisfied, but instead he simply nodded and thanked her. Then he did something that surprised her even more. He asked if she would be willing to meet with him in person, not as enemies but as two commanders who might have things to learn from each other. Lyria felt her eyebrows rise. She asked him why he would want to meet with someone who had just tried to humiliate him and chase him away. Murphy smiled. For the first time since the race ended, he told her that he did not believe she had tried to humiliate him. She had simply been defending her territory and testing his abilities. He said that in her position he would have done exactly the same thing, added that any commander who could lead a fleet for 300 years clearly knew things worth learning, and any commander who could admit when they were wrong showed wisdom that deserved respect. Lyria felt something warm spread through her chest. It Had been a very long time since anyone had spoken to her with such honest respect. Most beings either feared her because of her dragons or hated her because of her authority. This human seemed to do neither. He simply saw her as another person trying to do their job well. She made a decision that would have shocked her younger self. She told Murphy that she would meet with him at a neutral station halfway between their territories. They could discuss the possibility of cooperation between their peoples. Murphy looked genuinely pleased. He suggested a station called Haven Point that served as a trading hub for multiple species. Lyria knew the place and agreed. They set a time for 3 days from now. As Murphy's face faded from the screen, Lyria sat back in her chair and released a long breath. Her crew was watching her with confusion clearly written on their faces. They did not understand why she was treating this human with such respect after he had defeated their fleet. 3 days later, Lyria stood in the main docking bay of Haven Point Station with Ember and Frost at her sides. The station was enormous, with corridors that stretched for miles and docking ports that could accommodate hundreds of ships at once. Beings from dozens of different species moved through the crowds, shopping and trading and conducting business. Lyria had chosen to bring only a small escort of 5 guards. She wore her formal uniform, which consisted of silver armor that had been passed down through her family for generations. The metal was inscribed with ancient elven runes that glowed softly with protective magic. Her silver hair was braided in the traditional style of a fleet commander, and she carried a ceremonial sword at her hip. Ember and Frost drew stares from everyone who passed by. Most species had never seen dragons up close, and the 2 massive creatures made an impressive sight. Ember's scales gleamed like rubies in the artificial light, and small flames flickered between her teeth whenever she exhaled. Frost left a trail of ice crystals on the floor wherever she walked, and the air around her was cold enough to make people's breath fog. Lyria felt nervous, though she tried not to show it. She had commanded fleets in battle and negotiated with hostile alien governments, but this meeting felt different somehow. She was not sure what to expect from Captain Murphy. Would he be arrogant now that he had proven his ship's superiority? Would he make demands that she could not accept? She did not have to wait long to find out. Door at the far end of the docking bay opened and the human captain walked through. He was dressed in the same worn gray uniform she had seen during their first encounter. His hair was still messy, and his eyes still looked tired. Behind him walked 3 other humans. 2 were clearly security personnel with weapons holstered at their sides and alert expressions. The third was a woman with dark skin and short black hair who carried a datapad. Murphy saw Lyria and her dragons and smiled. He walked toward them with no sign of fear, despite the fact that Ember could have swallowed him whole. When he reached a respectful distance, he stopped and gave a small bow. Lyria returned the gesture with a nod. Murphy introduced the woman as Lieutenant Amy Chen, his second in command. The 2 security officers were named Carl and Maya. Lyria introduced her own guards and then gestured to the dragons. She explained that Ember and Frost were not pets or servants, but partners. They had bonded with her decades ago and shared a mental connection that allowed them to understand each other perfectly. Murphy looked fascinated. He asked if he could approach the dragons, and Lyria felt surprised by the request. Most beings avoided dragons whenever possible because they were dangerous and unpredictable. She told him that he could try, but warned him that dragons chose their own friends. Murphy walked slowly toward Ember with his hands held out to show he was unarmed. The red dragon lowered her massive head and sniffed at him. Her nostrils flared and smoke drifted up from her mouth. For a long moment nothing happened. Then Ember made a low rumbling sound that Lyria recognized as approval. The dragon allowed Murphy to place his hand on her scales. Murphy laughed with delight and stroked Ember's neck. He told Lyria that dragons on Earth were only legends from old stories. He said that seeing a real one was like meeting a creature from a dream. Frost moved closer and nudged Murphy with her snout. The human stumbled back a step but caught himself and reached out to touch the blue dragon as well. Lyria felt something shift in her chest again. The fact that both dragons accepted this human so quickly meant something. Important dragons could sense the true nature of beings, and they did not give their trust lightly. She suggested that they move to a private conference room where they could talk without interruption. Murphy agreed, and the group made their way through. The station people stopped to stare as they passed. It was not every day that anyone saw an elven commander walking peacefully beside a human captain, with 2 dragons following behind. The conference room was simple, with a large table in the center and chairs arranged around it. Lyria and Murphy sat across from each other while their respective teams took positions along the walls. The dragons lay down near the door with their tails curled around them. Murphy spoke first. He thanked Lyria for agreeing to meet with him and said that he hoped they could find ways for their peoples to work together. Lyria asked him to explain more about human technology. She wanted to understand how his ship had achieved what seemed impossible. Murphy nodded and Lieutenant Chen activated her data pad. A holographic display appeared above the table showing complex diagrams and equations. Chen explained that human fold drives worked by creating a temporary bubble in space-time. The ship did not actually move, but instead the space around it moved. From an outside perspective, it looked like instant travel, but inside the ship, time passed. Normally, Lyria studied the diagrams carefully. She had studied physics for decades as part of her training, but much of what she was seeing was completely new to her. She asked several questions about the energy requirements and the safety protocols. Murphy and Chen answered each question patiently. They explained that the technology was still relatively new and that humans were constantly improving it. Current fold drives could only be used for short jumps, and they required enormous amounts of power, but they were working on more efficient designs that would allow longer jumps and faster recharge times. Lyria realized that humans were at the beginning of something extraordinary. Give them another century of development, and they might be able to travel anywhere in the galaxy instantly, she asked Murphy what humans wanted in exchange for sharing this information. Murphy looked surprised by the question. He told her that he was not trying to sell her anything. He had simply wanted to meet because he thought they could learn from each other. Explained that humans were still new to galactic politics and that they made mistakes because they did not understand the customs and traditions of older species. Having allies who could guide them would be valuable. In return, humans could share their perspective and their technology with species who were interested. Lyria felt her respect for this human grow. He was not trying to gain advantage or make demands. He was simply being honest about what his people needed. She told him that the elven people had knowledge that might interest humans. Thousands of years of experience exploring space and dealing with other species, information about dangerous regions of space and hostile alien governments, and of course the secrets of dragon bonding. Murphy's eyes lit up at the mention of dragons. He asked if it would be possible for humans to learn how to bond with dragons. Lyria hesitated. Dragon bonding was one of the most sacred traditions of elven culture. The knowledge had been carefully guarded for millennia. But she looked at Ember and Frost and felt their thoughts brush against her mind. Both dragons were curious about this human and his species. They did not sense any danger or ill intent. Lyria made another decision that surprised herself. Told Murphy that dragon bonding required a deep connection between mind and heart. It was not something that could be taught easily, but if humans were willing to learn, and if the dragons were willing to teach, then it might be possible. She explained that there were wild dragons in several systems who had not yet bonded with anyone. If Murphy was interested, she could arrange for him to meet some of them. Murphy looked like she had just offered him the greatest gift imaginable. He accepted immediately. Weeks after the meeting at Haven Point, Lyria's flagship arrived at the Dragon Sanctuary in the Crimson Nebula. The sanctuary was a system of 3 planets that orbited a red giant star. The planets were covered in mountains and forests and deep caves, where dragons made their homes. No settlements existed here by ancient law. This was a place where dragons could live freely without interference from other species. Lyria had sent word ahead that she was bringing a human who wished to attempt bonding. Response from the Dragon Council had been mixed. Some dragons were curious about meeting a human. Others were skeptical that such a young species could form the deep connection required for bonding. But in the end, they had agreed to allow Murphy to try. Captain Murphy stood beside Lyria on the bridge as they entered orbit around the first planet. His eyes were wide as he stared at the viewing screen. Dozens of dragons flew through the atmosphere below. Some were as large as small ships, while others were no bigger than the human himself. They came in every color imaginable, from pure white to midnight black with scales that glittered in the red sunlight. Ember and Frost had flown down to the surface hours earlier to announce their arrival too. The Dragon Council now Lyria could see them circling above a mountain peak, where several other dragons had gathered. She told Murphy that it was time to go. The human took a deep breath and nodded. They took a shuttle down to the surface and landed on a flat plateau near the mountain peak. The air was thin here and cold despite the red sun overhead. Murphy had to put on a breathing mask to help with the altitude. Lyria felt fine. Elven bodies adapted easily to different environments as they walked. Toward the gathered dragons, Lyria explained the rules. She told Murphy that he could not force a bond. The dragon had to choose him just as much as he chose the dragon. She warned him that the process could be dangerous. Dragons tested potential partners to see if they were worthy. Some tests involved physical challenges, others involved mental ones. If a dragon decided that Murphy was not suitable, they would reject him. That rejection could be gentle, or it could be violent depending on the dragon's temperament. Murphy listened carefully and said that he understood the risks. The Dragon Council consisted of 7 ancient dragons who had lived for thousands of years. They were the wisest and most powerful of their kind. The eldest was a massive black dragon named Shadowfang, whose scales seemed to absorb light. Next to him sat a golden dragon called Sunfire, whose entire body glowed with inner light. The other 5 dragons represented different colors and elements. Lyria bowed deeply to the council, and Murphy did the same. Shadowfang spoke first. His voice was deep and seemed to come from the earth itself. He told Murphy that humans were unknown to dragonkind. They had heard stories about the young species who folded space and built strange ships, but they had never met one face to face. He asked Murphy why he wanted to bond with a dragon. Murphy stood straight and spoke clearly, despite the breathing mask. He told the council that he had spent his entire adult life traveling through space. He had seen incredible things and met amazing beings. But nothing had affected him as deeply as meeting Ember and Frost. He said that the connection between Lyria and her dragons was beautiful, the way they understood each other without words, the way they moved together as one. He wanted to experience that kind of partnership. He wanted to learn from dragons and hopefully teach them something in return. Sunfire tilted her head and asked what a human could possibly teach a dragon. Murphy thought for a moment before answering. He said that humans saw the universe differently than most species. They had learned to bend space because they refused to accept that some things were impossible. Maybe they could share that perspective with dragons. Maybe together, they could discover new things that neither could find alone. Several of the council dragons made sounds that might have been laughter or approval. Shadowfang exchanged glances with the other council members. Then he told Murphy that 3 young dragons had volunteered to test him if any of them chose to bond with him, the council would give their blessing. The first dragon was a deep blue color with silver markings along her wings. Her name was Stormwing, and she was known for her speed and agility. Told Murphy that she would test his reflexes. She took off into the air and began diving at him. Murphy had to dodge and roll to avoid her claws. Each pass came faster and closer. Lyria watched with her heart in her throat. One wrong move and the dragon could seriously injure or kill the human. But Murphy was quick. He seemed to anticipate where Stormwing would strike and moved just in time. After several minutes, the blue dragon landed and shook her head. She told Murphy that he was fast for a human, but not fast enough for her. She needed a partner who could keep up with her in flight. The second dragon was enormous and covered in gray scales that looked like stone. His name was Ironhide, and he was known for his strength. He told Murphy that he would test his courage. The gray dragon reared up to his full height and roared. The sound was so loud that it shook the ground. Then he breathed a stream of fire that turned the rocks around Murphy to molten slag. Murphy stood his ground. Lyria could see him shaking, but he did not run. When the fire stopped, Murphy walked forward until he was standing right in front of Ironhide. He reached out and placed his hand on the dragon's chest. He told Ironhide that fear was natural, but courage meant acting. Despite fear, Ironhide lowered his head and studied the human for a long moment. Then he too shook his head. He told Murphy that he respected his courage, but he needed a partner who was not afraid at all, someone who could stand beside him in battle. Without hesitation, Murphy looked disappointed, but he nodded and stepped back. The third dragon was smaller than the others. She was a deep green color with golden eyes. Her name was Whisper, and she was known for her intelligence. She did not attack or roar. Instead, she simply walked up to Murphy and looked into his eyes. Lyria felt the air around them change. She recognized what was happening. Whisper was entering Murphy's mind. She was reading his thoughts and memories, searching for something that only she could define. The process lasted for several minutes. Murphy stood perfectly still with his eyes locked on the dragons. When it ended, Whisper took a step back and made a sound that was almost like a purr. She told the council that she had found what she was looking for. This human had a mind that was open and curious. He did not try to hide his weaknesses or pretend to be something he was not. He was honest about his limitations but determined to overcome them. Most importantly, he respected dragons as equals, not as servants or tools. Whisper turned to Murphy and asked if he would accept her as his partner. Murphy's face broke into a huge smile. He said yes without hesitation. Whisper lowered her head and Murphy placed both hands on her scales. Lyria felt the moment when the bond formed. It was like watching two separate beings suddenly become one. Murphy gasped and staggered, but Whisper steadied him with her tail. The human's eyes were wide with wonder. He told Lyria that he could feel Whisper's thoughts in his mind, not as words but as emotions and images. Whisper told him that it would take time to learn how to communicate clearly, but they would learn together. The Dragon Council announced their approval. Shadowfang said that Murphy had proven himself worthy. He was now a dragon rider, the first human to ever achieve such an honor. Lyria felt proud, though she was not sure why. Murphy was not her student or her responsibility, but somehow seeing him succeed made her happy. Ember and Frost landed beside them and nuzzled both Lyria and Murphy. The four of them stood together on the mountain while the other dragons circled overhead. It felt like the beginning of something important. Months passed after Murphy bonded with Whisper, and in that time the galaxy changed in ways that no one could have predicted. The alliance between humans and elves grew stronger with each passing week. Human ships began using the routes through elven space, and in return, humans shared their full drive technology with elven engineers. The combination of human innovation and elven craftsmanship led to breakthroughs that neither species could have achieved. Alone, Lyria found herself spending more and more time working with Murphy. They met regularly to discuss trade agreements and defense strategies, but their conversations often drifted to other topics. Murphy would tell her stories about Earth and the struggles humanity had faced. Lyria would share tales of ancient elven battles and the history of dragon bonding. She discovered that she enjoyed his company. He made her laugh with his strange human humor. He challenged her assumptions and made her think about things in new ways. And Whisper had become fast friends with Ember and Frost. The three dragons would often fly together through the nebulas and asteroid fields. They seemed to communicate in ways that even Lyria could not fully understand. One day, Lyria received an urgent message from the Elven High Council. They wanted her to return to the homeworld for an important meeting. She felt nervous as she read the summons. The High Council rarely called for meetings unless something serious had happened. She arrived at the council chambers 3 days later. The room was enormous, with pillars carved from white stone and a domed ceiling, painted with scenes from elven history. 12 council members sat in a semicircle on raised platforms. Each was at least 500 years old and wore the traditional robes of their office. The eldest was Councillor Theron, who had led the elven people for over 8 centuries. He had silver hair that reached the floor and eyes that seemed to see through everything. Lyria bowed deeply and waited for permission to speak. Theron told her to rise and gestured for her to approach. He said that the council had been watching her work with the humans. They had seen how the alliance was changing both species. They had also received reports about other species who were interested in learning from humans. The council had made a decision. They wanted Lyria to establish a new organization, a group that would bring together different species to share knowledge and technology. Humans and elves would form the core, but others would be invited to join. The goal was to create cooperation across the galaxy, to break down the old barriers that kept species isolated from each other. Lyria felt honored, but also uncertain. She asked why the council had chosen her for this task. Theron smiled. He said that she had proven herself capable of working with beings who were very different from her own kind. She had put aside her pride and learned from a species that was barely 50 years into space travel. That kind of openness was exactly what this new organization needed. He added that Captain Murphy had also been chosen to lead the human delegation. Together, Lyria and Murphy would serve as co-directors. Lyria accepted the position. Over the next few months, she and Murphy worked tirelessly to build what they called the Galactic Cooperation Initiative. They reached out to dozens of species. Some were excited by the idea and joined immediately. Others were skeptical but agreed to send observers. A few rejected the invitation outright. But slowly, the organization grew. Scientists from different worlds began sharing research. Engineers collaborated on new designs. Diplomats worked to resolve old conflicts. And throughout it all, dragons played a surprising role. More, humans had traveled to the dragon sanctuary. Not all of them succeeded in bonding, but several did, and those who bonded became ambassadors of sorts. They helped other species understand that dragons were not just powerful creatures, but intelligent beings with their own thoughts and desires. Some dragons even chose to bond with non-humans. An insectoid scientist named Click bonded with a small purple dragon who loved puzzles. An aquatic ambassador bonded with a water dragon who could breathe underwater. Each new bond brought the species closer together. One evening, Lyria and Murphy sat together on the observation deck of Haven Point Station. They had just finished a long meeting with representatives from 12 different species. Everyone was tired, but satisfied. Progress was being made. Ember, Frost, and Whisper lay nearby with their eyes half closed but their minds alert. Murphy looked out at the stars and said that he never imagined his life would turn out this way when he had taken that supply run. Through elven space 6 months ago, he had just been trying to save time. He had not expected to race against an elven fleet or meet dragons or help start an organization that might change the galaxy. Lyria laughed softly. She told him that she had expected to chase away an arrogant human and get back to her normal duties. Instead, she had learned that her normal duties were too small. The galaxy was bigger and more complicated than she had realized, and there was so much more work to do. Murphy asked her if she ever regretted agreeing to meet with him. Lyria thought about the question carefully. She looked at Ember and Frost and felt their warmth in her mind. She looked at Whisper and saw how happy the dragon had made Murphy. She thought about all the species who were now working together because she and Murphy had taken a chance on each other. She told him that she regretted nothing. In fact, she was grateful. That race had been the most important thing to happen to her in 300 years. It had taught her that being the fastest or the strongest was not what mattered most. What mattered was being willing to learn, being willing to change, being willing to admit when you were wrong and when someone else had something valuable to teach you. Murphy smiled and said that humans had a saying, "The best journeys are the ones you never planned." Lyria agreed. She added that the elves had a similar saying, "The wisest warriors are those who know when to put down their swords." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the starships from a dozen different species move through the space around the station. Each one represented a different culture and history, but they were all here for the same reason, to build something better together. Ember raised her head and released a stream of fire that lit up the observation deck. Frost countered with a blast of ice that created beautiful crystals in the air. Whisper made a sound that was half laugh and half song. The three dragons seemed to be celebrating. Lyria reached out and touched Ember's scales. She felt the dragon's joy and pride. She also felt something else, hope. For the first time in centuries, Lyria felt truly hopeful about the future. Not because she thought everything would be easy. There would still be conflicts and challenges. Some species would refuse to cooperate. Some problems would seem impossible to solve. But she believed that working together, they could overcome anything. Humans had taught her that. They had shown her that refusing to accept limitations could lead to miracles, that looking at problems from new angles could reveal solutions no one had imagined, and that the youngest voice in the room might have the most important thing to say. Murphy stood up and stretched. He said it was late and he needed to get some sleep. He had a meeting with the Dragon Council in the morning to discuss expanding the bonding program. Lyria told him she would join him. She wanted to see more humans meet dragons. She wanted to watch as new bonds formed and new partnerships began. As Murphy walked away with Whisper at his side, Lyria stayed on the observation deck a little longer. She thought about that day when his tiny ship had appeared in elven space. She remembered how angry she had been, how certain she was that he would lose the race, how shocked she had felt when he vanished in less than a second. That shock had been the beginning, the moment when her old certainties had cracked open. And through those cracks, something new had grown. She smiled and stood up. Ember and Frost rose with her, and the three of them left the observation deck together. Outside the station, the stars shined bright.